Our role during puppyhood is to ensure that those unhealthy coping strategies are not successful. And by that I mean, if your puppy is having to resort to slam dunking every other puppy in the puppy class simply to keep itself protected from being slam dunked, that's unhealthy.
Hey, Drew here. Before we get started, I want to tell you about our sponsors for today's show. First, Colorado Citizens for Canine Welfare. Imagine a world where every dog knows the warmth of a loving home. A world where dogs are not trapped in small wired crates and dealing with extreme weather conditions and neglected by humans on a daily basis to turn a profit. Picture a place where mother and father dogs live free without the cycle of constant breeding and where puppies aren't commodities for profit. This is the world without cruel puppy mills. Let me introduce you to Colorado Citizens for Canine Welfare. 3CW is on a mission. A 501c3 nonprofit organization working tirelessly every day to turn this dream into reality. Join the fight against inhumane treatment of thousands of dogs trapped in commercial breeding facilities. 3CW aims to educate, enlighten, and to make a difference, to be the voice for the voiceless. You too can be a part of this necessary change. 3CW is dedicated to all dogs. They help guide puppy buyers to adopters towards responsible choices, adopting from licensed shelters, rescues, and ethical breeders. As dog lovers, we have to advocate for local and national animal welfare laws and be the change. Join us in creating a future where every dog has a chance to a warm and loving home. To learn how to find licensed, inspected shelters and rescues, visit the Find Dogs page at caninewelfare.org to learn how you can make a difference. Colorado Citizens for Canine Welfare, where compassion meets action. Also, Wonder Walker. A walk with your dog should be, well, a walk in the park, not a tug-of-war. The harness you choose should be safe for both you and your dog. As you know, I train dogs professionally, and the truth is that sometimes even trainers need a little help. For me, that means I prefer it when the dogs I'm training wear the best equipment. When it comes to harnesses, I ask my clients to get the Wonder Walker body harness for their dog because it will help me, them, and the dog meet our training goals as quickly and as safely as possible. I discovered Wonder Walker in 2009 and I've been using them ever since. The harnesses were developed in 2003 and they're still handmade by the same family-owned business in Seattle. They're the original no-pull harness. Here's why I'm such a huge fan. First, because the harness has 2 leash connections with 5 points of adjustment, so it's simple to fit for any size and breed. Second, since they fit properly, they help prevent injury and pain, which are common occurrences when using these mediocre harnesses. The bottom line, Wonder Walker has been my go-to harness for over 15 years. Visit wonderwalkerbodyhalter.com and use promo code LOVEDOG at checkout for 10% off discount. Love Dog is one word. That's wonderwalkerbodyhalter.com. Promo code LOVEDOG. Now, let's get on with the show.
So puppy socialization needs to not only be about tolerance training, it has to be about building resilience, because resilience is different. Resilience looks the same and has the same behavioral output. But what resilience is building the neurobiological processes that enable my brain to experience those stimuli and those cues and say, hey, I've got this.
Hey, Drew.
Hello, Mark. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you doing?
Good. I'm excited for our listeners today. They're in for a real treat.
Yeah, here we are. It's part 2 of our interview, of our series, I should say, with Kathy Murphy. She's a neuroscientist, as people know by now, over in Scotland. And we're lucky enough to have her on our show. And in part 1, we made it sort of a glossary. It was kind of fun. And we just kind of let people in on what they're going to be hearing about in part 2. So when we got to it in part 2, they'd actually understand. So here we are in part 2. And I just love that we talk about the different life stages of dog, from puppyhood on up through, I think, them becoming seniors, and how brains work during each of the different life stages. And for me, the takeaway is just, hey, the more you know about your dog's brain and how your dog thinks and feels, the more support you can give your dog, and the better friend to your dog you will ultimately be.
Well, you said it there, Mark. It's all about supporting them. And when you understand that there's different levels of cognition and different levels of ability at different stages of development, you can really set them up for success. I love the whole part about Kathy goes into the difference between building for tolerance versus building resilience and what that looks like, and some of the big mistakes we're making in raising puppies and adolescent dogs. So I think this is going to be really useful for people.
I hope so. And do you want to tell them a little bit quickly, a 1 line or 2 lines about Kathy, just to remind them who she is?
Yeah, Dr. Kathy Murphy's the Chief Scientific Officer for Behavior Vets, and her company is Barking Brains over in the UK, but she's also affiliated with Behavior Vets New York and Colorado, and she's just a wonderful addition to all of those practices with obviously her expertise and her lending her knowledge and credentials to all of these organizations. So she's here to expand our brains and teach us what we need to know about our dog's brains so we can set them up for success.
Okay, and there'll be a full bio in the show notes as always, and any relevant links. So with that, I say we move right on over into the next studio and meet with Kathy and talk to her.
Let's go listen and learn.
Okay.
And we're back, and we're joined again by Dr. Kathy Murphy, who's going to help us make sense of our dog's brains using her big brain, and Mark and I asking inane questions as far as trying to make sense of our own dogs. Really, you're just here as a private consultant, so Mark and I can have better behavior outcomes and really get into the nuts and bolts of our dog's brain. So
You're very welcome.
And I really want to know, Kathy, how can understanding the basics of neuroscience and these terminologies and these big concepts that might be over people's heads, how can that really help? And you said earlier, setting us up for success. So I'm thinking about stages of development. So moving from, getting that first puppy into adulthood, what kinds of things should we be thinking about those little brains as we're going along to make sure they are set up for success?
So I think the terminology that's used often about puppies is that their brains are sponges. And that's actually quite a useful way to think about puppy brains, because they're really designed to be able to gather as much information as possible. They don't filter out very much information when they're that young, because their brain is going to develop according to all of that information. So they want to absorb it all. Now, if the adult dog had a brain that absorbed all of that information and didn't filter any of it, going back to neuroeconomics, the adult dog would be exhausted. It would have to eat for like 40 hours in every 24 to be able to get enough energy to be able to support those processes. So somewhere in between puppyhood and adulthood, the brain has to be able to process all of the information that it's receiving in order to habituate a lot of the thought processes, so that when we're in adulthood, the brain is able to filter out all of the information that is irrelevant in the moment. And remember that information that's filtered out will be different depending on what the circumstances are. So the information that the brain is filtering out when your dog is resting on the sofa is very different to the information that your dog is filtering out when you're in a training session with your dog. And to be specific, when your dog's resting on the sofa, its brain isn't processing what you're saying because you're irrelevant to its resting. I mean, not always. It's not an absolute, but it's tuning out most of what you're doing and most of what you're saying because the dog is resting.
When you're saying filtering, Kathy, is that a good example of what a lot of trainers do with this process of desensitization, where we're trying to make something relatively arbitrary in the environment rather than the dog kind of fixating and getting focused on it?
Ooh, you just stepped on a landmine, Drew.
Okay, sorry.
That's a very complicated discussion to be had. It's complicated because the process, the protocol of desensitization is not neurobiologically what's happening in the brain. So neurobiologically, desensitization is about actually reducing the neuronal and network sensitivity to certain inputs. But that isn't necessarily what's happening when we are utilizing protocols of desensitization. There are lots of different neuronal processes that could be going on when we use a protocol of desensitization. And some of those may involve true neuronal desensitization. Usually they do not. Usually they'll involve processes like building tolerance, building resilience, or changing somehow the response of the brain to that sensory input, as opposed to making the brain less sensitive to that sensory input. Now, those processes don't happen in isolation, which is why I said you trodden on a landmine, because it gets complicated really quickly. Because actually what's happening when you work with a desensitization protocol is all of those processes all at once. It's just that within the dog world, if you like, the assumption is that the leading process is neuronal desensitization, and that absolutely is not the leading process. That's very rarely what's happening. Probably the best example of true desensitization is when you're desensitizing to the auditory stimuli associated with fireworks.
Sure.
The problem with fireworks is that they're not only dealing with the auditory stimuli, because often it's a pressure stimulus that actually evokes the response from the dog. But that's a separate conversation. Whereas if we're desensitizing a response to other dogs or a response to horses, for instance, we're often in the realm of building tolerance to that stimulus and or a different behavioral response to that stimulus that isn't desensitization, but that is the dog understanding that we don't want them to behaviorally respond in the way that they have been behaviorally responding to that stimulus. So that's crossing over into the realms potentially of counter conditioning, if it's a conditioned response in the first place. And so building tolerance or building resilience. Building resilience is great, and it looks exactly the same as building tolerance, but of course the neuronal processes associated with it are very different, and the downstream effects on the cortisol production, adrenaline production, and the experience of stress are very different. Building tolerance can be exceeded much more easily in the moment. So if you're only relying on building tolerance for your desensitization, then you're much more likely to have a breakdown at some point because that tolerance can be exceeded. Whereas if you're building resilience, you're actually changing the response to that stimulus so that it becomes less stressful. And that's more likely to involve desensitization, true neuronal desensitization. So that's a tangent. I can't remember now why you brought that example in, but I can definitely get back to it.
No, it's great. And you're saying things like resilience and tolerance, which you and I have talked extensively about elsewhere. And really it prompts me to think like, what are our puppy socialization models getting wrong with this current culture of puppy quote unquote socialization? Often looks like, okay, well, I'm going to help my dog to tolerate this environment and these stimuli in the environment. What are people doing wrong? Maybe
it's a good example, actually, of what we were just talking about those parallel processes of building resilience, building tolerance, and desensitizing. They can all be useful. So as we're socializing puppies, the puppy's brain is going to need to develop so that it becomes more sensitive to the cues and to the stimuli that make it successful as an adult, and so that it becomes less sensitive to the cues and the stimuli that make it unsuccessful. Now, bear in mind here that we humans decide what is successful and what is unsuccessful. And we're not necessarily in control of what it takes for the dog to be successful or unsuccessful. For instance, if I live in the city, there are some things outside of my control, but humans on some level have decided that dog will live in the city. So the dog definitely doesn't have control over those stimuli. So we've decided somehow, what those inputs are going to be and what behavioral outputs are going to make that dog successful in that environment. But the puppy's brain is going to have to develop in a way that becomes more sensitive to the stimuli that make it successful, less sensitive to the stimuli that make it unsuccessful. It's also, to some extent, going to have to develop the behavioural repertoire of tolerance to things that it finds stressful. Because if there is no tolerance at all to any level of stress, that puppy is not going to be successful. Now, this is a subtlety, and it's a subtlety that isn't binary, it's on a grayscale. But if we only rely on that puppy developing tolerance to what it finds stressful, you can see that the more the puppy has to tolerate, the more we're potentially impacting on that puppy's quality of life. Because tolerance isn't fun. Tolerance is doable if it's, within the realms of what I can cope with. But when it gets to the point that my only tools in my toolbox are tolerance, I'm having to tolerate a lot. And that becomes draining economically, neuroeconomically draining as we move through life. And if I'm adding in, I'm tolerating XYZ situations, and now I'm adding in maybe a little bit of pain from a little bit of arthritis. And we know that dogs suffer from arthritis at a much younger age. We used to think of it as an old age condition. We now know that it's a young age condition in canines as a species, or pet canines as a species. So if I'm now adding in pain, that is adding in a factor that is going to drain my tolerance. It basically is going to lead to me exceeding my tolerance much more quickly. So puppy socialization needs to not only be about tolerance training, it has to be about building resilience, because resilience is different. Resilience looks the same and has the same behavioral output. But what resilience is building the neurobiological processes that enable my brain to experience those stimuli and those cues and say, hey, I've got this. That's not stressful. That's well within my coping repertoire. I've practiced a whole bunch of coping skills. I've developed a whole bunch of coping skills during puppyhood that have enabled me to be more resilient, so that that's not neuroeconomically a drain on my resources. That's fun, or that's okay, or that's neutral.
Kathy, talk about that a minute. I wanted to jump in there because you said coping skills, and I think this is so important and something I've seen in all the years of puppy classes I've taught, where you get these like totally different strategies, I call them, from puppies, where, you've got the shy puppy who's, obviously that's a label that I can operationalize as hiding behind the person's legs or table. And then you've got the other puppy who's trying to make everybody go splat, which might also be a coping mechanism to initiate the play and interactions. But it all comes from this sort of like insecurity, trying to work it out, trying to learn about the world. Talk about coping skills and puppies, and then we'll kind of think about how that transitions towards adolescence and adulthood.
So puppyhood is all about trying different coping strategies. So puppies will thrive if they are given a safe environment to try out different coping strategies. The same as children. It's no different to the child psychology literature. The brain development during that stage is all about, let me try things and see what works and what doesn't work. So our role during puppyhood is to ensure that those unhealthy coping strategies are not successful. And by that, I mean, if your puppy is having to resort to slam dunking every other puppy in the puppy class simply to keep itself protected from being slam dunked, that's unhealthy. And that's not going to be successful in adulthood, because that's going to look like I'm jumping on a bunch of adult dogs that are going to turn around and have a go at me. So we need to ensure that that isn't successful, so the puppy isn't enabled to practice that behavior, that we interrupt that behavior. And if we're really doing it well, we're actually spotting that before it escalates to our puppy having to slam dunk every other puppy in the puppy class, because we're catching it at a much earlier stage. Now, if we see that same puppy responding to being the one that's slam dunked, responding by removing itself from that situation to assess what's going on and look for a way to permanently remove itself, so put a barrier between itself and the other puppies, to come to a mum or dad to say, hey, I need help, I'm being slam dunked. That's a healthy coping strategy, because that's exactly the kind of coping strategy that an adult dog is going to be successful at. If another dog runs up to it in the park and it then turns to you to say, hey, I need help, that's going to be incredibly successful. And that's going to avoid a fight situation. It's going to avoid the dog being overwhelmed. So we can look for reinforcing those choices. So when we see that in the puppy class, we can now use what we're learning in the puppy class in terms of reinforcement learning. So we're learning clicker training, we're learning using food rewards, we're learning using toy rewards. We're learning using the reward of have that be successful. So I've spotted you need help. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to create that personal safety barrier around you, whatever it takes to do that. Depending on the setup in the puppy class, it might mean, hey, I'm going to take you outside the puppy class to decompress for a moment and then wait until all the other puppies have a little bit more order before we bring you back in. But I'm going to reinforce that choice of healthy coping strategy by making it successful. The bit we get wrong is when we step over that. So when our puppy is being slam dunked and it comes to us for help and we go, hey, and then maybe give it a stroke but carry on chatting, we leave that puppy vulnerable to being slam dunked again. It tries to get our attention again. We carry on chatting because we don't recognize that it's actually choosing a healthy coping strategy of asking us for help. And then it gets slam dunked the third time and decides that coping strategy ain't working. I now need to switch coping strategies because my puppy brain is developing. So I need to find a strategy that's going to be more successful. And my second choice is I'm going to slam dunk the puppy back, which may be fine in the moment. But if that becomes a repeated strategy, that's going to be unsuccessful. It may be I'm going to turn around and give it a full set of teeth, particularly in adolescent dogs. And if that is successful, if that's the only way that puppy can get personal space is to show a full set of teeth, its puppy brain is developing around that experience. And so showing a full set of teeth is going to be my go-to next time I'm in a similar situation.
Yeah.
So I think what you're saying there, when you give the example of the puppy going to the parents and the parents are like, nice puppy, and then it's not really what the puppy is looking for at that moment, right?
Yeah.
The way to frame that for me is the puppy's needs aren't being met.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it happens enough times, the puppy will go to plan B.
Yes.
And plan B might be showing some teeth.
Mark, you've hit on a really important point there, because at some point the puppy has to decide what strategy I'm going to do because that strategy isn't successful. But what else it's learning in that interaction is mum or dad don't understand my language. Mum or dad aren't the go-to people when I'm in trouble. So there's a whole bunch of layered learning in that missed opportunity. Now, we've all done it. So I'm not saying go away and feel like you're a bad person because you messed up. Like, it's just part and parcel of how we relate to our dogs. Sometimes I get it right. Sometimes I miss the cues. Mm-hmm. But I think going back to what can we do better in puppy class, we can actually operationalize that, to use a word that you used, Drew, for our puppy carers to say, look out for those opportunities. What is your puppy saying? Because in that example where I'm looking for my puppy to come to me for help, I hope I'm catching it before my puppy realizes it needs to come for help, because what I'm watching in that play interaction is that my puppy's play has got closer to my personal space. Because when I see my puppy playing, if it's feeling confident and if it's feeling like it's got this, my puppy's very happy to play a further distance away from me. But that play that still looks the same level of calm and still looks the same level of happy gets closer towards me as the puppy's certainty level decreases about whether it's got this, whether it's in control, whether it's safe, whether it's okay. And that's before it tips over into, I need help, which is when the puppy actually comes directly to you. But subconsciously, the nervous system is having the motor system get those circles of play closer and closer to my personal space, because it makes it less risky, so that if the puppy needs to scream, I need help, it's closer to me. And I can watch that. So you can actually do this with computer systems, right? So you can put trackers on the individual puppies in the moment and watch them on the screen. And you can track what's the path of my puppy so that I can see what that play pathway looks like. And then I can see how confident or how lacking in certainty the puppy is. If the puppy's play is always around my personal space, it's not confident enough yet. And that's not bad. It's just information.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break right now, but do stick around, because when we come back, Kathy's going to explain how your dog's brain works and functions during various life stages, beginning with puppyhood and going right through adulthood. It's good stuff to know, so stay with us.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying our episode so far, and I want to thank the fine folks who've been helping bring it to you. Starting with Colorado Citizens for Canine Welfare. We love dogs, but what if loving our dogs is not enough? To truly love dogs is to hope for all dogs to live without fear and be treated with compassion and dignity. That's why we're teaming up with Colorado Citizens for Canine Welfare, or 3CW, to educate all dog lovers to stand up to puppy mills. Join our efforts to end the inhumane treatment of thousands of dogs who are trapped in commercial breeding facilities. Together, we can impact national animal welfare policies that shape the culture around pet keeping. Don't turn a blind eye to this suffering that is right in front of our eyes every day. To find licensed, inspected shelters and rescuers, go to the Find Dogs page on caninewelfare.org. Together, we can make a difference. And also, Wonder Walker. As I mentioned earlier, these harnesses were developed in 2003 and they're still handmade in Seattle by the same family. And what I know is that a lot of love, care, and passion go into these harnesses to make sure the quality is never sacrificed. They're available in extra small to extra large and an endless range of colors, and they make walks with your dogs easier and a lot safer for you and the dog. Visit wonderwalkerbodyhalter.com and use promo code LOVEDOG at checkout. Now let's get back to our conversation with Dr. Kathy Murphy, where she was just telling us about setting our puppies up for success and understanding the importance of what their play style is telling us.
Well, this brings up two things for me. And the first thing is I see this play out all the time with my dog, Hank, who everybody knows at this point I adopted in July, and he's 4 years old. So he had a life before me. And one of the things that I'm most fascinated by and happiest with is that when he's off lead, and he sees another dog in the field, he literally stops, he looks at me, he's asking me for permission, can I go? And I say, go on, Hank, play, and he runs.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
It's the most wonderful thing. He was taught that. But what I want to say is you've both said, you use the term, we're setting the dog up for success, right?
Yeah.
What you're also doing is you're setting the dog and the human up for success to have a much nicer long-term companionship together.
Definitely.
When the dog does things like this, it's much less stress on me and it's a joy. And I just happen to be fascinated by the fact that the dog knows to do this, which brings me to my next point, which is in this conversation, and you kind of just said it, we all make mistakes. We're asking a lot of dog owners. And this is where the idea of abuse comes up for me a little bit, because without a dog owner knowing enough about what the dog's capabilities are, you were talking before about tolerance, teaching the dog to tolerate if that's the best you can do. The dog only has, just like humans, certain capabilities. If you ask a human to do something they're not capable of doing, it their brains just can't do.
Yeah.
If you demand it, if you continue to demand it, even without the intention of being abusive, because most people don't want to be abusive, it can become abusive. This is why it's important to know about neuroscience. This is why you are here today, because if you can start to at least have an appreciation for and understand what is going on inside the brain of the dog, then the idea of success will come a lot more easily. It'll just be a better outcome, I think.
And you're both saying this term, the idea of success, and defining success, and so much of that is our human expectations, right, Kathy? So you're talking about successful repertoires, and really one of our goals in puppy class should be teaching the dogs how you're going to be successful in not only our environment, but navigating the human world. And so even Hank asking Mark, can I go and interact? That's a great way. And really what we're trying to teach from a behavioral standpoint is come check in with me, and where is that comfort bubble, which sometimes we see change as we move towards adolescence, where our puppy is glued to us. And then all of a sudden that one day they get the wild hair and that recall training seems to be gone and they're going to investigate the wildlife or whatever it is down the road. And we're like, what just happened? Like, I just put so much time and energy in. I meet so many people who are frustrated around, somewhere between 8 months and 13 months. And the dog seems to have forgotten everything they worked on so hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's happening in the brain as you transition towards that adolescent brain, and really where should we define success when we're going through that stage of development?
Yeah. So the one important thing to recognize about the adolescent brain is that it's different to the puppy brain and different to the adult brain. And lots of things, whether it's cognitive processes or emotional processes, are perfectly possible in the puppy brain and perfectly possible in the adult brain, but are super mixed up in the adolescent brain.
That's a nice way to say the brain leaves for a few months.
Ethologically, it makes sense because adolescence is all about leaving the nest. I know puppies don't have a nest, but, like leaving the safety and security of the parental environment, of the litter environment. It's all about going out and finding your way in the world. And that adolescence phase is the same for all mammalian species, as in the purpose of the adolescence phase is the same for all mammalian species, is actually very similar for all non-mammalian species also. There is a phase during nervous system development in all species that is all about how that individual becomes autonomous. So how that individual supports its own success in the world, as opposed being dependent on others for their success. Obviously, there are species differences, and there are some species that are born and are independent and can live independently straight away, but that's not what we're talking about. So the adolescent brain is very much geared to that, and that means that some things have to change. So, for instance, the puppy brain is all about seeking safety and security and getting that maternal bond, whether that maternal bond is actually with its mother or dam, or whether it's the transferred maternal bond that we have between,
Sure.
humans and the dog. The adolescent brain isn't going to be successful if it focuses its resources on that safety and security, because that's going to have it not explore the world. The adolescent brain is going to be successful if it says, hey, I can conquer the world. There are no risks here. There is no mountain too high. There is no valley too low. I can go get it all.
Much to our dismay.
Yeah, exactly.
So they're teenagers.
Completely teenagers. So that comes along with increased risk taking, which, doesn't look like going out drinking on a Friday night for our dogs. But it does look like running as fast as I possibly can towards what is clearly a cliff edge and thinking it might be really fun to launch myself off it. So, we have these stories of adolescent dogs launching themselves out of windows or launching themselves off a cliff. It seems like a great idea at the time because my adolescent brain says there ain't no mountain high enough, there ain't no valley low enough. So there is an ethological logic behind these switches. And what's happening in the brain in terms of these switches is that we're getting changes in the excitation of neurons and the inhibition of neurons. So there are a whole network of neurons called inhibitory neurons, which are responsible for creating the complexity of our brain function. So the increase in inhibitory neuron maturation during adolescence leads to changes in the way that the brain processes information and changes to the decisions that come from processing that information. So where in puppyhood, my decision might have been to withdraw with a certain set of sensory inputs, during adolescence, because we've changed that ratio of inhibitory neurons to excitatory neurons, now the same brain makes a different decision, and that decision is to approach. So it's a case that to us, the behavior is completely changed, even though the inputs are the same. I said the same cue. I set it up in the same way. We haven't changed anything about where we walk. But actually, the dog's brain is now processing all of that information and coming out with a different mathematical result that says, hey, let's have a different approach behavior, for instance, in that example.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that we're seeing different behavioral results, even though we're putting in what we think is the same information.
Right. And we sort of think that should be like a linear progression, like I've been learning and learning, and we're going to keep going, where all of a sudden it seems like, and if I'm hearing and understanding right, when it comes to these neurons, that's why so many people struggle, especially at adolescence, when they're trying to teach things like, quote, impulse control, or, trying to build latency between stimulus and response, where they're trying to get the dogs to stop and think, like Mark was saying. And really the dog is like literally incapable of doing that, especially if they're watching a visual or hearing an auditory cue, because that brain is so like tunnel vision, right?
So it's a really good example because impulse control has been really heavily researched because of its implications for human teenagers. And what we know is that the adolescent brain really struggles with impulse control relative to the puppy brain and to the adult brain. Now, intuitively within our culture, we accept quite readily that the adolescent brain struggles with impulse control compared to the adult brain, but we still haven't wrapped our heads around the fact that it actually struggles with impulse control more than the puppy brain. Wow. So our puppies are going to find it easier to learn how to do a downstay. We get them into adolescence and we say, hey, you've already learnt the downstay, so you should be able to do that. Now we're adding in distraction, distance, all of the, the Ds. We're doing, we're taking you to an agility trial and wanting you to do the downstay now. But like you say, it's not linear, because that was easier for me when I was a puppy. Now I'm an adolescent. That's really hard. And yet I'm not being rewarded to the same extent when I do a fantastic downstay in adolescence, because you're assuming that I should already know this stuff. And yet I'm telling you, my brain is finding this really hard. This is exhausting for me to do this downstay. It's not that I can't necessarily do it, although believe me, on some days, my adolescent dogs can't do the downstay. But on lots of days, they will do the beautiful downstay, but they're not getting the credit for it because I'm like, yeah, but we did that in puppy class and that was super easy. So just recognizing that the neuroeconomics of the downstay is tipped towards draining resources in adolescence has us give the dogs a massive jackpot for that amazing downstay. Because the reward should be proportional to the effort, not to the perceived effort according to the task.
Well, and that's really interesting, Kathy, because I feel like people and dogs both are getting really frustrated at adolescence, and probably why we see the highest percentage of dogs in shelters and who are rehomed and given up on around adolescence, because people are struggling with this phase of development where the dog is also struggling from a cognitive standpoint, right?
Completely. And if you approach it from a neuroscience perspective, what you would do is you would do your training during puppyhood. And to go back to your point, what should we be training them in terms of socializing? If we want to walk through a park or along a street without our dog having to say hello to everyone and having to jump up and jump all over people, we should not be setting them up to do that in puppy classes. So we should not be saying, hey, I'll let you off your leash and let you free play for 10 minutes. We should be saying, let's practice the behaviors that we want to see in adulthood. So socialization should all be about working towards the ability to ignore all of those social cues and be comfortable and happy ignoring all of those social cues. And, it's a tough call. My German Shorthair Pointer is 2.5, and we're still working on that because, any visual cue, and he's like, whoa, that's exciting. Yeah. So, it's a work in progress. But then during adolescence, we need to, like you say, recognize that those things that we practiced in puppyhood, so the sit, the downstay, the whatever it is you want to train, and, training will look very different depending on whether you're training for husbandry and lifestyle type behaviors or whether you're actually training for, high level dog sports behaviors. But whatever it is that you're training in puppyhood, that's really valuable.
Yeah.
But that is something that you're going to be able to go back to in early adulthood to get the benefit of.
So don't give up hope when your teenager rebels, because you're going to get back there, right?
Yeah, it's not about expecting that dog can reproduce that behavior reliably along a linear scale throughout brain development. That is not what's happening. We've kidded ourselves into thinking that's what we're doing.
I have a question. what age does the dog become an adolescent? And then at what age is the dog an adult? Is your 2.5-year-old pointer an adult, or is it an adolescent still?
And do you need to divide that into sexual maturity and behavioral maturity?
Yeah, so I believe that he's not through adolescence yet.
Okay, that's interesting.
But you notice the word believe.
That's a scientific term, right? Do you want to define?
Yeah, it's probably not possible to ever answer that question for pet dogs, because that question, in order to be answered, we have that answer in other species. But in order to answer that question, we have to use a whole variety of scientific methodology, most of which involves taking large populations and killing them at each day during adolescence.
We're not going to do that.
Slicing up their brains, looking at them under the microscope, etc. So we're probably never going to have that level of certainty with pet dogs. However, what we can do is map on what we see with adolescent dogs onto what we know in other species. And so what we know for certain is that pet dogs' brains do not mature along the same trajectories as other species. We know that all of the mammalian species that are similar that we've looked at have different trajectories for different cognitive processes and different emotional processes and the interaction between those two. We also know that pet dogs have been selectively bred for particular behaviours and purposes. And so we also know that it's very likely that there are breed differences. In fact, I would eat my hat if there aren't breed differences in that maturity process during adolescence. And Erin Heck's data kind of hits upon this to some extent, but there's a lot more work to do to get specific around the developmental trajectories. Another person to look at is Mohammed Spokter, who I love, who runs the Dog Brain Project.
Kathy, are you mostly talking about how people will say like a smaller dog will mature faster than a large breed? So our mastiffs and our, bigger dogs are going to be more like 2 to 3 years versus a smaller animal being closer to 1 year. Is that a good ballpark, or it just depends on each dog individually?
It's just so specific to the individual breeds and probably to the lines, the genetic lines within the breeds, that it's tricky to be accurate. It's true that we see physical maturity in small breeds sooner than we see physical maturity in large breeds. But that doesn't necessarily relate to maturity of cognitive processes or socio-emotional processing, for instance.
Can I ask you a question about how does that impact? People ask all the time coming out of puppy classes and things like that, like if they are choosing to spay and neuter, what's that timeline? And you hear that discussion around skeletal and osteoarthritis conditions and concerns. And then now there's some journals and some information regarding the development or potential for cancer. But how does it affect cognitive and maybe hormonal development if you were to say spay or neuter too early, or is there too late?
Yeah. So the long and short of it is that that's another example of an experiment we could do, but we're never going to do.
Sure.
In terms of getting that precisely nailed down. What we do know is that hormones are an essential part of brain maturity and development. So logically, it would make sense that they would have access to their natural endogenous hormones, the hormones that their bodies produce, right the way through until their brains are fully mature. Now, going back to your question mark, we don't know when their brains are fully mature. It looks likely that it's something around between 2 years old and 4 years old. It's certainly much further out than we ever thought it was. We used to think their brains were fully developed by 18 months. It looks extremely unlikely that that is the case. It's certainly not the case for all dogs, but it looks extremely likely that that's the case for any dogs, for instance. But the 18 months is probably the soonest that the brain could be mature. And 4 years is probably the latest that the brain would mature, and that dogs fit somewhere in the middle there.
It's a good timeline, though, for people to consider and say, like, when they're thinking about it, you start to see an increase in certain behaviors that you might associate with sexual maturity, like especially with males, like marking and humping and things like that. And I know that's often part of that balance equation of like, if I'm considering neutering, should I do that? And it's sort of that balance of, can I live with this behavior?
Yeah, that's the tricky bit, because if we were going to leave it till the brain had matured along a natural trajectory, we would leave it till much later. And so, the ballpark figure is, I say, this is a personal choice based on information that I have kind of processed, which is for a bitch, I would like them to have at least 1 season, ideally 2 seasons, before I would even consider whether to spay them at that point. But I still wouldn't necessarily spay them at that point. But there are pros and cons that feed into that depending on the individual circumstances. However, I may choose to spay a bitch much earlier than that or a male dog, I may choose to castrate them much earlier than that, because my decision isn't only dependent on how their brain might develop if all other things were equal, because their brain isn't developing in a vacuum. It's developing in my home, which in my case is a multi-dog household, which is in a particular rural location that comes with all of those caveats, or it's in a city location, which comes with all of those caveats. So all of those other factors are influencing how that dog's brain is developing and what those behaviors are, and which of those behaviors are going to make it successful in my eyes and not successful in my eyes. In other words, are they behaviors that are going to be okay for this lifestyle, or are they behaviors that are not going to be okay? Some of those decisions are on an individual basis. Some people may live in a household where they don't mind their dog jumping up on people. If I have a dog that's, 10 pounds and I live in an environment where most of the people coming to my home are comfortable with dogs, I don't mind if the dog jumps up, but those circumstances being different, I might really mind if the dog jumps up. And if the dog's maturity, whether that's physical, sexual, brain maturity, is leading to more of that behavior, and I think that neutering the dog is going to help to reduce activity levels and enable me to be able to get that behavior under control, because I think it's at some point driven by those sexual hormones, then I'm going to take the decision to neuter the dog earlier. Jessica Heckman and I actually did a webinar where we go into this over a 2-part series, and she gives a brilliant synopsis of all the health reasons, the pros and cons, and I delve into some of the behavioural impacts that we think spaying may have, may not have. To cut to the punchline, we come to the conclusion that it's very much an individual decision. Sure. Jessica Heckman actually runs a consultation service where people can pay her for an individual consultation to make that decision. She also says that most people come knowing what the right decision is.
I think now would be a good time to break away for a moment and just mention to our listeners that there are a number of ways, important ways, that they can support us. If you're listening and you're enjoying the show and you're finding it helpful, here's what you can do. 1, you can spread the word. Word of mouth is the best way to get the message out there. And tell anybody you know, a friend, a family member who has a dog that you think might also enjoy it and find it helpful, just to take a listen. That would be amazing. You can follow us on your favorite podcast app. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok. Our handle is @LoveDogNews. That's @LoveDogNews. And the most fun is you can buy us a cup of coffee. You can go to Ko-fi, which is KO-F like Frank I.com/lovedog, and donate to the show, which is a great way to support us. And we set the minimum donation at $4, I believe, so it's not going to break the bank, as they say. All right, so we'll get back to the show now. Just wanted to remind you there are things you can do to help us along. So where I want to pick up is about dreaming. I know that dogs dream because I see it all the time, I hear it all the time, and I'm fascinated by it all the time. What's going on in the dog's brain?
Super interesting. So we don't know. That's no surprise. We don't know what the dog's experience is. We know that what we're seeing would appear to be similar to human dreaming. And by that, I mean not only the physical responses and the auditory responses that we're experiencing. So the dog, whining, yelping, barking, moving their legs, twitching, etc. So not only that, but we know from EEG experiments, which are where you put electrodes on the outside of the dog's skull. We know from EEG experiments, so that's non-invasive work, that the brain activity patterns have similarities with human dreaming. Now, the dog's sleep pattern is different to the human sleep pattern. So their sleep cycle is different to the human sleep cycle. So again, that introduces some level of we need to be careful not to overinterpret the data, which is why I say we still don't know whether the dog is experiencing dreaming in the same way as we're experiencing dreaming. We experience dreaming by focusing on what we're thinking about during the dream, for want of a better term, if you like. So what do we remember as being the story of our dream? Because we still don't understand how dogs experience episodic memory, so how they experience putting together multiple pieces or puzzle pieces of a memory to be able to reconstruct what happened in the past, we don't necessarily know what that experience of dreaming is like. But what we do know from other species and from humans is that dreaming looks like it's a really important component to memory consolidation. So we know that there's a really important part of memory consolidation that happens during sleep. Memories aren't only formed during sleep, clearly, because I can remember what we said during this conversation and I haven't slept during this conversation. But the conversion of short-term memories into long-term memories and the laying down of layers of consolidated memories predominantly happens during sleep.
Kathy, can I ask you, with this memory consolidation, how important is that when people are considering their training approach for their puppies and adolescents especially? But as far as, I always kind of think of it as a place of overstimulation, like these really busy environments, and continuing to layer on information, especially on those young dogs' brain, versus giving them that downtime for acquiring that skill and that knowledge and that memory consolidation.
Yeah, so definitely for puppies, you want to be setting up your training on a learn something, do something, sleep. Learn something, do something, sleep. Learn something, do something, sleep. Because the consolidation is happening during sleep. Now, the really important part in terms of avoiding the creation of behaviors that are unsuccessful later in adulthood is don't sleep when you're in the middle of drama. Do something that helps the individual decompress. So what I mean by that is you don't learn something in a puppy class, have it be really overstimulating, and then say, hey, go to sleep and consolidate that. Because the puppy is consolidating what you intended for it to learn, plus all its thoughts and feelings about that overwhelm and that overstimulation. And that's not what we want. We don't want to overlay any potential anxiety. And I don't mean by that the puppy's like, oh, I'm overstimulated and looks anxious. I just mean that overstimulation does neurologically create some anxiety that the puppy's brain is having to process. We want to wash that out with decompression before we consolidate those memories. And there's a balance to be had because we can't go and take the puppy for an hour-long walk in the woods to decompress before it sleeps, because the puppy is going to be sleeping like as soon as it gets in the car. But what I mean is we do something in the puppy class, the puppy's excited, it's learning, etc. And then we may increase the distance between that individual puppy and the puppy class for a bit of decompression and a bit of wind down before we get back in the car when we know the puppy's going to sleep, or before we put the puppy in a crate, depending on how your puppy class is set up. If it's set up so that puppies can sleep during the class before it goes back in the crate to actually fall asleep. What you don't ideally want is puppies, the same as we don't want this for humans, falling asleep because they are exhausted. I don't know if you've noticed, but if you fall asleep when you're either exhausted or drunk, you tend to wake up less refreshed than if you fall asleep after a period of decompression and relaxation.
Kathy, I have noticed.
Right. And that's the same for our puppies, is in households that are super, super busy and in environments that are super, super busy, puppies tend to only fall asleep when they're exhausted. And that sleep doesn't look the same. So to go back to your point, Mark, that won't look the same in terms of dreaming because the sleep cycles won't be the same, and the balance of rapid eye movement sleep versus non-rapid eye movement sleep won't be the same. So you won't have the same memory consolidation, you won't have the same experience, and the body won't wake up biologically refreshed in the same way.
Do you think, or I should say, I think, that another conversation to have around sleep is around sleep disruption. And not so much in terms of there being physical manifestations like a gait change, but in terms of there being behavioral changes. So if a dog's sleep is being disrupted for any number of reasons, it could be something going on the outside of the house or something going on the inside of the house, but the dog's normal sleep patterns are disrupted.
Yeah.
How does this, now we're back to the neuroscience, how does this, which I love, change the dog's brain? And just a few examples, because we could spend 10 more hours discussing all that, obviously.
Definitely.
Yeah, just how does it change, whether it's the cortex, the amygdala, the limbic system, the neurotransmitters, the coupling, all this stuff that we've learned about, and then how does it manifest?
So let's talk about coupling, because this is actually a really good example that impacts coupling.
Oh, so I gave you a good segue there? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it was a beautiful segue,
Hooray.
Mark. I love it.
I did it. Good.
So disrupted sleep can be more influential in a negative way on behavior than total sleep deprivation. Now, obviously, if you're completely sleep deprived, you can't function at all. But most individuals, most young, healthy individuals, can compensate for lack of sleep quite well. But what's more difficult to compensate for is disrupted sleep. And the reason for that is that disrupted sleep is interrupting sleep cycles in a very erratic way. So it means that the brain patterns are being interrupted mid-flow in a very erratic way. And what that tends towards is uncoupling. So what happens is you don't notice that impact whilst the dog is in its sleep period. You just get the disrupted sleep. And the dog may wake up and not feel particularly impacted by that disrupted sleep. So it's not necessarily going to wake up feeling, oh, I feel so lethargic, in the way that we might expect it to if it had got no sleep that night. But because sleep disruption tends towards uncoupling of brain areas when they're doing complex tasks, as that dog is going about its normal day, things like emotional stability, things like decision-making are potentially going to be much more difficult, in some cases impossible for the dog, simply because those brain areas that were coupled before, so those brain areas that were in sync or in symphony together and activating at the same time or in the correct pattern of activity that has them be coupled, now are uncoupled. So that brain activity is disrupted and, for want of a better word, more chaotic. That doesn't mean that all things are impossible. We all know that if we have a disrupted night of sleep, we can do stuff, but it does mean that it's much more difficult for us to do. Yeah. It takes a lot more effort. It takes a lot more energy. And some of those things go wrong very easily. Now, if we add on to a disrupted night's sleep pain, or if we add on to a disrupted night's sleep, hey, I want you to learn this new thing that's really difficult to learn that we've never done before, then it becomes even more difficult because of that decreased coupling. And brain coupling isn't binary. So you don't have brain areas that are either coupled or non-coupled. They either have a high level of correlation or a low level of correlation. So it's either a high level of functional connectivity or a low level of functional connectivity. And you can be anywhere on that grayscale. So the more chronic the sleep disruption, the more disrupted the coupling becomes, the more chaotic the brain activity becomes. And so then what may happen is that the dog defaults to more easy behaviors. And those are going to be conditioned behaviors, habitual behaviors, or behaviors that are just simpler, behaviors that are just easier.
Yeah. When you ask the dog for something complex and they just start throwing that behavior chain, like, are you sure you don't want shake? How about this? Have you seen this before?
Exactly. And we might think, hey, what's going on here? You know perfectly well what I'm asking for. But unless we're stopping to think, is there a reason why this is more difficult than it would be usually, then we're not wondering whether there are other factors feeding into that.
Right. We might start telling a story like, oh, that's just his favorite behavior, or he hates doing the downstay. It's like, oh, maybe he can't process what you're saying.
Well, you can start to become curious. I mean, if you see the change, you can say, has anything changed in the household?
Yes.
Which is creating this change, which I may not have been aware of, but maybe I ought to think about. So, I wonder if his sleep has been disrupted. I haven't been feeling well the last few nights. I've been waking up in the middle of the night to go use the bathroom or whatever it could be.
The human can disrupt the sleep.
Yeah, this is disrupting the dog's sleep because the dog sleeps in the room with me.
Babies coming into
crying.
the household.
Perfect.
Yeah, they
Perfect.
disrupt the dog's sleep as much as they
Right.
disrupt ours. Night shifts.
Perfect.
They disrupt the dog's
Guests.
sleep just as much as ours. Guests definitely disrupt the
Okay, so
sleep.
this, it's just stuff to begin to become aware of, I think.
Well, and I think that's the big takeaway, Mark, is you learn these complex, huge concepts, and you're like, oh my gosh, my gray matter is hurting after talking to Dr. Kathy Murphy. What can I actually do with it? And just like Mark said, you become curious and you start going, oh, maybe my dog isn't stubborn. Maybe there's something that's impeding learning. Maybe, oh, when I had those fun friends, from university that came to visit, and my dog didn't do so well, it's because their normal pattern just kept being disrupted or whatever it was that made it difficult for the dog. And really, if anything, like the talk about sleep, we're just moving towards a place of better well-being for dogs and advocating for them in new ways. And the more we know, the better we can do when it comes to setting them up for success, right?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have put it better myself.
Well, good. That's what I'm hearing. Hey there. Just one last quick little break before we wrap up our conversation today. I just want to remind you that this episode was brought to you by Colorado Citizens for Canine Welfare. Attention, dog lovers, we've got a real problem. Every day, thousands of dogs are being bred in this country to produce for-profit puppies. These dogs are kept in deplorable conditions and routinely bred to turn out litters of puppies to be bought and sold in pet stores across the country. This has to end. Together, we can stand up to these cruel practices and say enough. We have teamed up with Colorado Citizens for Canine Welfare to educate, advocate, and stand up for dogs everywhere who desperately need our help. To learn how to find licensed and inspected shelters and rescues, go to the Find Dogs page at caninewelfare.org today. Also, Wonder Walker harnesses. This versatile dog harness is great for all dogs, especially those who really pull against your leash. You'll notice a difference on your walks right away, and it should give you peace of mind to know you're using the best equipment. Go to wonderwalkerbodyhalter.com and use promo code LOVEDOG at checkout. wonderwalkerbodyhalter.com. Now back to our show. Now, we've taken so much of your time, but I absolutely can't let you go without asking you about my favorite topic, which, as you might remember, is play. Because I think people think about play as like this separate thing, like there's learning and training, and then over here there's play. And I just think play is so vital and crucial to the human-animal bond, and I think it's a great way for learning. You were just talking about decompression and letting things go, and it just feels like the brain is going a different direction when you're in play. Tell me what's happening to dogs' brains during play. What's happening in my brain that I like playing with dogs so much?
Yeah, so going back to the neurotransmitters, which takes us right back to the beginning of the podcast, the neurotransmitters that are released during play are released in different ratios than they are released in other phases. So when a dog is engaging in play, they've got endorphins running around their body, for instance. Now, the endorphins in and of themselves contribute to that feel-good factor, which is why we enjoy playing. So that's good for the dog's well-being. We're improving the dog's well-being and increasing the chances that the dog will be enjoying whatever it is that we're doing. So we can pair up the training with the play to kind of get that enjoyment involved in the training, for sure. And at the same time, the increased levels of endorphins actually change the way that other neurotransmitters function, like dopamine, like serotonin. So play is a good example where we can shift what's called the cognitive bias of the dog Because when a dog is engaged in play and its brain is saturated in those neurotransmitter ratios that are involved in play, they are more likely to be in a positive cognitive bias. So they're more likely to be sensitive to reward and resistant to punishment, which is a good thing when we're training them, particularly if we're relying on reinforcement learning when we're training them. So we're relying on rewarding them for the behaviors that we want to see. So it makes them more sensitive biologically. It's making their brains more likely to pick up when you're rewarding and more sensitive to that reward. And therefore, the learning process, that's one of the reasons why it boosts learning, is because play increases the sensitivity to reward. So it's going to boost that learning. And in parallel to that, it's actually improving the cognitive processes that go along with that learning. And that's not only reinforcement learning that we're in charge of, but a whole bunch of non-reinforcement learning, so observational learning, social learning, etc. So it's boosting that cognitive ability associated with learning. So play and learning definitely go together. And if you look at the child psychology literature, you'll see that those themes run through child psychology very clearly. And we've got very clear structures around how play can support learning for children. I bow to you really, Drew, because you live in this world. But I think we have a good understanding within the dog world that play is beneficial for learning. I think what I see as potentially an area that could be improved is how we operationalize that within our puppy classes, within our one-to-one interactions with our dogs.
Well, and something I want people to do less is outsourcing that play to others. You know, in puppy class, we're learning, play happens with other puppies. And then they get this model where I have to go to the dog park or the dog daycare for my dog to experience play, or I have to hire somebody. It's like, that should be the greatest thing you get to do with your dog, and finding ways to build in those natural reinforcers. I love how messy it can be. You know, I can go out there with a toy and the dog's making all those quote unquote mistakes and undesirable behaviors, barking at me and jumping, trying to get the toy. And then through just good timing and thoughtful success, I can say, okay, when you lay down, I'll start the game. When you sit, I'll start the game. And I can really manipulate my reinforcement, but in a way where the dog and I are more forgiving versus like a formal training session. People like, oh, he's just not getting it. Oh, my timing was bad, et cetera, et cetera. Versus play, it's like, we'll get it next time. We'll get better. No big deal. Ouch,
definitely.
that was my finger. I need to get this better.
Yeah, definitely. And also what's interesting from a neuroscience perspective is that if you are enjoying the training session, your brain is also changing the ratio of neurotransmitters. You are also getting more endorphins and enkephalines, etc. And that is also changing your cognitive bias.
Well, and how much more bonding is it when I'm engaged in a task with my dog versus putting a piece of food in his mouth?
Yeah.
Well, this is, okay, so Drew, this is, again, here we go, comes back to why it's so, I think, important to walk your dog. Take beautiful walks with your dog. Yeah, it's for the dog. But guess what? It's for you too. Yeah. And if you're enjoying it as much as the dog is enjoying it, it's a form of play.
It's a mutually beneficial activity.
It's a more meditative form of play, perhaps, but you're out in nature, unrestrained to some extent, and it's the same thing.
Kathy, is play an antidote for, or the antithesis? Is it the opposite of stress? Thank you, Mark, with the assist. I feel like play and stress like just can't exist in the same realm in the dog's brain. Is there anything to that?
Maybe. It depends on how you define play. And the reason I say maybe is that some of your listeners will be familiar with a series of experiments in the laboratory that are called rat tickling, which do what they say on the tin.
Jakpanskip.
Yes, which is where you literally tickle rats. So you roll them over on their backs and you know, I'm doing a thing to the camera. Your listeners can't see me. I don't know how to describe this with words, but you're tickling their bellies. There's a whole conversation around that, as in, what are we seeing? What are we measuring? What's the experience of the rat? And it isn't necessarily the case that those rats are having an enjoyable experience. And I liken it to when you're being over-tickled as a child, particularly by a stranger, incidentally, because that has a different neuronal process to the same activity. But when you're being tickled past the point at which it's enjoyable, you're still giggling, you're still laughing, and to some extent you're still engaging in the behavior, but there's a sliding scale of enjoyment to non-enjoyment. So yes, I think insofar as if it is determined as play by the individual, so if the individual gets to choose what is play and like, operationalize
so
that.
like the more autonomy, the more agency they have in the play to move their bodies, to interact in ways that they would choose, or to give them outlets for species typical behaviors, you might see more benefits for everybody, right?
So insofar as I would like my dog to be playing and I would like that to be enjoyable, yes, that is probably not going to be able to exist in parallel with acute stress, may be able to exist in parallel with chronic stress. But of course, it's all dependent on my dog's experience of play. So that's my only caveat, is that we have to remember that what we are labeling as enjoyable play, we have to remember we only know if it's enjoyable if we ask the individual, and we can't ask the individual. So that's why rat tickling is a discussion to be had, because some of those rats are probably enjoying it, and there is some scientific evidence that some of those rats are enjoying it. However, when you look at the experimental design, it doesn't exclude the possibility that some of those rats are not enjoying it.
Well, I think there's no doubt that we just recorded a 2-part series, and I think that part 3, which we will now do, is going to be on rat tickling. What do you think?
When we start loverat.com.
Yeah, Love Rat. It's
Kathy,
the Love Rat podcast. Okay.
We really wanted this to be an introduction for people to understand what's going on inside their dog's head. So many of Mark's questions are like, what is going on with my dog? And we really want to have some clues to that internal state. And you just said it during the play discussion as well. We don't know, but this neuroscience is helping us to get our heads around what that might be and how to improve wellness outcomes for our dogs. We said this was going to be Neurology 101, and it turned into a masterclass. So thank you for teaching us today and giving us this.
You're
if people
welcome.
want to learn more, if they want to dive even deeper with you, where's the best place for people to learn more and to learn about what you're doing and the work you're doing?
So they can come to my Facebook page, which is Barking Brains at Neuroscience is Awesome on Facebook. They can also find me at Behaviour Vets. I'm Chief Executive Officer at Behaviour Vets, and I work in the education department with Bobby Banbury, who you will know very well.
Yes. Hi,
so
Bobby.
I have a lot of webinars that are freely available, canned content freely available to buy, and also my upcoming events are there. And I will soon have a Barking Brains website. So that will make it much easier for people to search my freely available content and my paid for content.
There's some great content on there, and we will surely have you and Bobby in the future, because what we're getting at with all this, and you said it multiple times in this episode, was creating resilience in dogs, which creates better wellness outcomes. So we'll have to have you and Bobby bring your Resilience Rainbow Tour onto the podcast. We'd love to hear more from you and to learn more about your doing. But thank you for all the work you do and sharing with us today.
Thank you so much.
And I will sign off by saying thank you. It's been such a pleasure. And we could keep going, right?
I know. You've done well to corral me. I can go down any one of those rabbit holes.
Well, let's just end this show with giving you Dr. Kathy Murphy, the last word.
Oh, that's putting me under pressure, Mark. I would just say, I think to your listeners, don't worry about the complexity of neuroscience. Neuroscience is beautifully complex. And there are lots of people that are spending their time thinking about the complexity. Just listen, take what resonates, play with it, have fun. And yeah, that's all I want to say.
Well, that concludes part 2 of our 2-part series with Kathy Murphy, our neuroscientist from way over there across the pond in Scotland. I found it fascinating and helpful. I learned so much. I hope you did as well. And if you did, you may even want to go back and review parts of it because there's just been so much information that she's delivered to us. If you did find it helpful, hey, could you tell a friend or tell someone you know that has a dog that might also want to learn about it? Could you leave a comment? Could you follow us on your favorite podcast app? Maybe buy us a coffee on ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/lovedog. And until next time, happy howling.
Hey, I can conquer the world. There are no risks here. There is no mountain too high. There is no valley too low. I can go get it all. I need help.